What's up guys, welcome back to another video on European Yu-Gi-Oh cards. In this video I'm going to be talking about the GX era of Yu-Gi-Oh cards and giving a demonstration of the differences between European and North American cards from that era. If you haven't seen my previous couple of videos about the original era of Yu-Gi-Oh cards in Europe, I'd encourage you to go and watch those first, because they contain some relevant background information for these videos as well. As I said in my last video, for the sets between Soul of the Duelist and Flaming Eternity, Upper Deck actually produced all of their cards in North America, even though there were slight differences between the boxes produced for Europe and those produced for distribution in the USA. But when they moved to printing the actual GX sets, starting with the Lost Millennium, they also decided to finally move the printing of European Yu-Gi-Oh cards back to Europe. Now the reason they had moved it in the first place was to try and help the European TCG catch up with North America, because it ended up being over a year behind by 2004. But by the time the Lost Millennium came out, the TCG had more or less caught up, and that's why they moved it back. Now by this time, the E in the card code of European cards had also been removed, and all English cards had had the prefix EN added instead. But despite that difference being removed, there are still a lot of differences between the cards produced in Europe and those produced in North America for the GX era. As I just mentioned, the first GX set to be produced in Europe as part of this new era was the Lost Millennium. And before I go into more detail talking about the cards and the ultimate rares in particular, I'm first going to talk a little bit about the sealed boxes. So you always know you're looking at a European box rather than a North American one by a couple of different factors. The first one is that up until Strike of Neos, all European boxes had the incomplete circle seal, so there's a circle on both sides of the box, whereas all North American boxes from any era have the complete seal. The other way to tell is if you look at the back, it says printed in Belgium, whereas for a North American box it says printed in the USA. So the next thing that's different about European boxes is that there's no hobby retail distinction. So if you look at the back of this box and you compare it to North American boxes, you would think that you're looking at a retail box because that's got the same code. But in practice, you can actually pull any one of the 25 ultimates in this set out of this exact box. And the last thing I'm going to say about the sealed boxes is that it is much, much rarer to find a sealed European print box of any set than a North American one. So that applies to the single cards as well, because the whole print run is smaller thanks to the European market, especially at this time, being a lot smaller than the North American one. But the sealed boxes are actually disproportionately rare, because for some reason they just were not kept sealed in Europe in the same quantities that they were kept sealed in America. Now, when it comes to transferring the rarity of the boxes to the rarity of the single cards, it's actually a little more complicated. Because if we said, for example, that this box, in terms of the quantity originally produced, was 3 times rarer than the North American one, that would not translate to saying that this Hero Signal Ultimate Rare is 3 times rarer than this North American one. Because in order to say that, you'd also have to know a lot of different things, like how many retail boxes were produced compared to hobby boxes, and other factors like that. Now that the sealed boxes are out the way, I'm going to go into a little more detail about the cards themselves. So starting off with these two, I have a couple of Hero Signal Ultimate Rares from the Lost Millennium. The one on the left is a European print, and the one on the right is a North American print. Some of the differences between these cards actually apply to non-Ultimate Rares as well. So the deeper colors on the European card are present on all cards in the run, and also if you can see, the corners are cut a little more softly and more rounded on the North American cards than they are on the European ones. Those couple of points apply to all European cards from this era. Moving on to the Ultimate Rare part specifically, for the set TLM, the European Ultimate Rares were produced with an extremely high level of surface gloss. You can see with this one on the left. Whereas this North American copy on the right, you can hopefully see that the whole surface is pretty flat and pretty dull. But the more important difference, for most collectors at least, is the fact that for the European cards from this era, they have a lot more detail in the Ultimate Rare stamp. So you can see all of these different little patterns emerging when I shine the light on the card. Whereas the North American ones, they're not completely flat in the Lost Millennium, but there's very, very little texture, and all of the detail from the European one is pretty much not present. And just to show another example of that, here's a couple of token festivals. And again, the North American one on the right, when you shine it in the light, there's a little bit of detail on the foil, but it doesn't really pop that much. Whereas when I put the European one in the light, you can see a lot more detail and a lot more depth to the foiling all over it. Now, one thing to note about European TLM Ultimate Rares is that they have probably the highest print quality of any European set. Now, what I mean by that is not just that the cards look nicer than other sets, but more importantly that the actual production quality is much higher in terms of the quality of the cardstock, the quality of the cutting, and the amount of care taken to avoid other issues. So when you pull a European TLM card straight out the pack, you can pretty much expect it to be in gem mint condition. It's pretty rare for it to have the whitening that you see on later European cards, and even in the light, there's very little ultimate stamping, if any, on most cards from this run. Now, unfortunately, that quality did not last, and even when you just look at the next set, Cybernetic Revolution, the cards have a lot more issues than TLM. And just before I go on to talking about that, I'm just going to point out that in this video, I'm only talking about first edition Ultimate Rares. And unlimited Ultimate Rares from GX are a whole different story. They have a lot of different oddities and anomalies from pretty much every single set. And so if I do make a video about those, it'll have to be a separate video since there's just so much else to discuss. Now, moving on to Cybernetic Revolution, as I just mentioned, the cards are a little bit lower quality than the Lost Millennium in Europrint. So if I put this Wing Karibo level 10 side by side with another effect monster from the Lost Millennium, you can hopefully see right away that the colors are a little different between the two of them, and they're actually made of a different cardstock as well. So if I put it in the light, you can see the Wing Karibo has a lot less gloss on the surface than this Hyraka Sphinx. In addition to that, the Ultimate Rares from this set still have quite a lot of detail in the pattern. You can see it still pops pretty nicely, but if you compare it to a Lost Millennium card, there's a lot less clarity in the foiling, and it doesn't pop as much. So as well as that, you also have the fact that from Cybernetic Revolution onwards, it's much more common to have edgeware and cornerware on the back right out of the pack. So if I flip this Wing Karibo over, you can see this is not a played with card at all, but if I show you the bottom right corner, it's got a little white chip here, which is actually just from the factory cutting process. The blades were not as sharp, and therefore you often had little bits of the card breaking off. It's also more common from this set onwards to see the stamping on the back of the card. It's not too bad on this Karibo, but often it will be a bit worse than that as well. Just to be clear, even though the European cards from this set are not quite as high quality as the TLM cards, they still have a much more detailed Ultimate Rare stamp than the North American ones. So I have here a North American Skyscraper, and if I put it in the light, there's a very, very small amount of detail up here on the foil, but it is more or less flat. And that goes for most other North American Ultimate Rares from this era as well. Whereas this Power Bond, which is a European print, first off, again, you can just see that difference in color. The one on the left is deeper than the one on the right. But if I show it in the light, you can see that the foil, even if it's not quite as bright as a TLM card from Europe, still has a nice amount of detail, and that is not present on the North American version. Moving on from CRV, they kept the cardstock and the designs of the cards more or less the same for the next few sets. So I've got a few different European print Elemental Energy Ultimate Rares here, and you can see the Ultimates still pop nicely. The cards are still pretty glossy, but they're not as glossy as the Lost Millennium. And the colors, again, are similar to what they were with Cybernetic Revolution. Shadow of Infinity also kept the same stock, but this set there are actually a few different things to mention about the European release. One thing which unfortunately I don't have an example with me is that for every ultimate rare from this set, you can actually pull the first edition version with a silver eye of Anubis, as well as the gold eye. And this is not a counterfeit or anything like that when you get that. It's just a simple error that happened in the factory. The other thing with European Shadow of Infinity is that the cards often have quite a lot of factory damage on the back. Not just even the ultimate rare stamp, which you can see this card has a bit of, like up there with the attribute, but the cards actually even have little dents and impressions in the surface right out of the factory. So I've owned a lot of Pack Fresh European SOI cards, and the exact issues can vary, but a lot of them have some kind of issue like that. So European SOI in particular is extremely difficult to grade. Final set to feature a similar cardstock to the first edition run of Cybernetic Revolution is Enemy of Justice. So what I have here is a European print Dreadmaster and also a North American print Harpy's Pet Baby Dragon, just to show you the differences again between the two runs. So Enemy of Justice in particular has extremely deep colors on the Europrint cards. You can see it really looks a lot different to this Harpy's Pet Baby Dragon. And again on the foil, it's got a nice amount of detail going on, whereas the North American Enemy of Justice Ultimate Rares have more or less no detail whatsoever in the foiling. For all the sets I've discussed so far, the European Ultimate Rares look a lot more interesting than the North American ones. But when we move to the next release, which was the Power of the Duelist, the differences between the Ultimate Rares from Europe and North America, even though they still exist, become a lot less interesting. So I have a European Flare Scarab here alongside a North American Aqua Dolphin, and when I put them in the light, you should hopefully be able to see that even though there is still a difference in how obvious the Ultimate Rare pattern is, it's a lot less noticeable than it was for the previous sets. And on top of that, the differences in color and font are a little less noticeable as well. You should still be able to see that European cards, the corners are cut a little sharper than North American, but on the whole, the differences between the two prints were becoming smaller at this point. So on top of these European print cards being a bit less interesting than the ones that came before, the print quality also took another hit when Power of the Duelist came out. So by the time you get to this set, it's almost impossible to find a card which doesn't have any edge or corner wear right out the pack. And so they become very difficult to grade as well. When Strike of Neos came out, Upper Deck changed the cardstock again, both for European cards and for North American cards. So I'll show you one last example of how to tell the difference for those sets. This is a European Spiral Serpent on the left and a North American's Frostosaurus on the right. Now, as with other sets, there is a slight color difference. The North American one is slightly warmer overall than the European one. And there's also a difference in the Ultimate Rare stamp. You can see, even though the North American one is quite nice by this point, the European one still pops a little better. But the main difference with the cardstocks used for this set is the texture. So the North American one went from being more or less dull for the previous sets to having a bit more of a gloss to the surface. And meanwhile, the European one went from being glossy to having more of a dull texture. It's hard to explain exactly, but the surface is very matte for this set, and it almost feels wet to touch. Now that I've said everything I wanted to say about European Ultimate Rares, we're pretty near to the end of the video, but there are a couple of things I still wanted to mention. So the first thing I thought it was worth pointing out is that European Secret Rares are also different from their North American counterparts. So here's a couple of Vorse Raiders from the 2005 tins. Again, the one on the left is European, the one on the right is North American. And as well as the colors being different, you should hopefully be able to see that when I shine the foils, the European one has a much brighter foil pop to it than the North American one. And that is true as well of cards from booster sets. So I've got a couple of Secret Rares here from Strike of Neos, and you should be able to see this is the North American one on the left, European one on the right, that the European one, the Secret Rare foiling pops a lot more than the North American one. There are also a couple of differences to note to do with the video game promos from this era. So I'm going to show you a couple of worm baits from TF04. And this is the North American version on the left and the European one on the right. Now, right away you should be able to see that the North American one is ultra rare and the European one is super rare. And that's true of a few other sets from this time as well, that they released super rare versions instead of ultra rare versions in Europe. But probably the more interesting point about this is that whereas the North American copy is produced on North American cardstock, the European one, they kept the same style as the original video game promos. So this card is not printed on European cardstock, it's printed on OCG cardstock, just like the original video game promos, DDS, FMR, those kind of sets were printed on in America. The last thing I thought I'd mention in this video is the run of wrong name rares from DB1. Now these are pretty well known misprints. Basically every rare in DB1 was printed on this run with the name of a rare from DB2 instead. But what a lot of people don't know is where these came from. And the answer to that is these came from the 2005 European tins. So each tin contained one pack of Dark Beginning 1, and that's the only place you can get European Dark Beginning 1 from. And pretty much every pack, if not every pack, contains one of these wrong name rares, if it contains a rare. So I just thought I'd mention that in case anyone's curious where these came from. And that does it for this video. So thank you everyone for watching. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, because it helps out a lot. And if you have any questions about anything I said in this video, or suggestions for future videos, just put them down in the comments below, and I'll be happy to read everything and reply to you all as well. I'm not planning to make any more videos about European cards specifically in the near future, but I do have other content planned. So yeah, thanks for watching guys, and I will see you soon.